like to say a couple of words.
Good day, folks. Thank you so much for attending this webinar. I want to thank you all for joining in, and on behalf of the Education Committee, welcome. I hope you get some good information, be able to use it. And I'll turn things right back to Erin to please introduce our speaker, Drew Douglas.
Great, thank you, Stuart. So to begin, I'd just like to give you a quick intro to the GoToWebinar doc for those of you who are new to this, so you can see where things are and how to participate and everything. On the GoToWebinar doc, which is on the right-hand side of your screen, there should be 3 drop-down icons with drop-down arrows. The first is your audio, which will let you know that you're muted for this webinar, and I'm going to tell you how you participate in just a minute. The other area I'd like to draw to your attention is handouts with the page icon. So there's a handout for this webinar, and you can download that from the page icon right now. It has key points and spaces to take notes, so it'd be useful to have that open during the webinar. And then finally, you'll see a questions chat area with the hand icon, and this is how you can participate in the webinar. If you have any questions during the webinar, please type them into that window. I'm going to monitor all questions related to the webinar content, and we'll have a Q&A at the end of the webinar. And we'll also ask you a couple questions during the webinar, and you can respond to them in that questions chat area, and I'll just read them out so that Drew sees them or hears them. Also then, if you have any questions about technical things, you can type them into that chat area, and Rick Condon is going to respond to those. So Rick is CSSE's Digital Marketing and Communications Specialist. He's providing our tech support today. So we can say hi to the folks, Rick.
Hi, everyone. How are you?
All right, so without further ado, I am going to turn this over to Drew Douglas. Drew started in OHS in his home, Rama First Nation, 9 years ago. Since then, he has acquired 2 safety certificates and been promoted twice. Drew is the proud CSSE professional member, past chapter chair, and currently serves on 2 national committees. He hopes to impart his passion for training through this presentation. Welcome, Drew, and over to you.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. So today's webinar is really focused on the supporting AV when it comes to training and presentations. And I just want to preface this whole webinar by saying I am not a designer by any means. I don't own CorelDRAW or anything like that. I've never used any kind of Photoshop or any of those fancy programs. Just somebody that's keenly interested in presentation design and making better and better supporting AV for training. So I'm also going to use those 2 words, presentation and training, kind of in place of each other. When I say one, I'm actually referring to either or. So for today's webinar, there's kind of 3 topics I want to focus in on. So I'm going to focus on how we can make our training presentations easy. And by easy, I really mean easy to understand. So you might have super complicated, zero energy state training program, but how can we make it easy for the participants in our audience to kind of grasp the concepts we're delivering to them? How can we make our content fun? And again, I'm really talking about the supporting AV when I talk about the fun. I am going to drop a few other gems that aren't necessarily to do directly with supporting AV, but the main focus will be on supporting AV. And then finally, and probably most importantly, is how can we make our presentations memorable, right? If your training content is not memorable, well, then what was the point of delivering it at all in the first place, right? So a really good metaphor, I think, to describe all 3 of those things is how can we give our participants Disney World, right? So Disney World, if you think about it, it's a super easy to understand place, right? It's a super complicated place. I don't know if you know, I did some research doing when I was creating this webinar and this presentation originally, and I learned that Disney World actually has a whole underground network of roads and pathways and a whole community underground for the employees to travel to and from different areas in Disney World. All the garbage is removed underground. There's whole trucks and everything that move underground. One of the interesting things I found out doing this research is Walt Disney himself actually paced out and ensured that every garbage can in every park was a maximum of 30 paces away from another garbage can. So he kind of reasoned that you walk about 30 paces before you throw your garbage on the ground. So that's how complex and to the level that he created that park. But us going there as a guest, it's a super easy to understand, fun place to be, right? With regards to fun, you know, why do adult couples with no children attend Disney World? I have no idea, but I guess it's because it's a very fun place, right? And then memorable, Disney World, if you've ever been, I'm sure you remember very vividly your trip on Space Mountain, or It's a Small World, the ride, or whatever rides you went on while you were at Disney World. So that's kind of what I want you to keep in your back of your head as we go through this webinar. When you're creating training, when you're creating presentations, how can you give your participants Disney World? The other thing we're going to do is, as we go through each of these modules, I'm going to apply them for you in real time to a very simplified slide deck, one probably most of you might even have, an IRS slide deck. So very simple 4-slide deck. So we have our kind of our title slide as our first screen here, and it kind of gives a quick introduction to our topic. I'm not going to go through this. I know all of you are safety experts and understand the IRS intuitively. And then each of our next 3 slides are going to be the duties of each of those main parties in the IRS. So I'm using Ontario's legislation for the creation of this. Not that I'm going to go through all this content, but that's kind of the background for this slide deck. So we'll go through the employer, duties of the supervisor, and the duties of the worker. And I think that's a pretty standard slide deck, the way that that has been designed. You got your basic bullet point lists full of content, and as you go through and deliver your training, hopefully you're elaborating on each of those bullet points and you're doing more than just simply reading your slide. But for the most part, this is the kind of slide decks I see. And I go to, you know, a couple of conferences a year. I attend a lot of CSSE chapter meetings, and most speakers, this is kind of the paradigm we're in right now when it comes to presentations. I blame Bill Gates. I think that if Microsoft PowerPoint didn't have a default with a bullet point in the content section, we wouldn't be in this situation that we're in with the kind of training and presentations that we all deliver. So I'm going to put myself into the picture here. Welcome, everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we can make our presentations easy first. But before I do that, I just want to show a very quick video that I think really encapsulates the problem we're in right now with training and or presentations.
There's some things I hate about PowerPoint, and I figure it's kind of my duty to point them out. So here we go. Here's common PowerPoint mistakes. Number 1, people tend to put every word they are going to say on their PowerPoint slides. Although this eliminates the need to memorize your talk, ultimately this makes your slides crowded, wordy, and boring. You will lose your audience's attention before you even reach the bottom of your first slide. Please don't do that anymore, please. Number 2, most common, many people do not run spell check. Big mistake. Nothing makes you look stupider than spelling errors. If it's got a red line under it, recheck the spelling. And then finally, I hate this. Avoid excessive bullet pointing, only key points. Too many bullet points, and your key messages will not stand out. In fact, the term bullet point comes from people firing guns at annoying presenters. Hence the bullet point.
Yeah, that's Don McMillan, and I think he really hits the nail on the head with some of our presentations and some of the training that we see today, especially with regards to the bullet points, people reading their slides, things like that. So, as I said, I want to start by talking about this easy module. So how can we make our presentations and or training easy? There's 3 things I want to talk about. So first of all, how can we keep it simple? How can we show data in more easy to understand ways? And of course, one of my kind of topics that I am big on when it comes to creating any kind of supporting AV is the use of bullet points. Is it necessary or not? So we'll get to that. So, and then we'll apply these three ideas to our initial slide deck that I started off with, that IRS slide deck. So keeping it simple, what I mean by that, the KISS rule, is using less copy on our slides. And copy is a big fancy term for text, okay? So using less words on our slides. So if we can think about a better way to create supporting AV so that there's fewer words, the better place we're gonna be in. And I'm gonna illustrate that in a few different ways. First of all, how many of you think you're great multitaskers in the room? I'm not gonna ask you to type it into the chat or answer that, because I think many of us tend to think we are good at multitasking, but a lot of research very lately, especially in the neuroscience field, has proven that we do not actually have the ability to multitask as humans. Multitasking is, in fact, a myth. Instead of multitasking, what we actually do is we switch task. So we actually move from one task to another very quickly usually, but we can't focus on two different things that require any kind of cognitive skill, cognitive ability at one time. It's impossible for our brains to do that. So when we think about that in terms of us standing up in front of an audience and delivering a presentation with supporting AV, we're basically forcing our audience to choose between listening to us and reading our slides. Now, unless you are a trained speed reader, which I suspect none of you are, and I suspect less than 1% of any audience you ever train or give a presentation to will ever be, the way most of us read is we actually say the words aloud inside our minds, and we listen to those words inside our minds. So how does that apply to what I'm talking about? So when we say those words aloud inside our minds, we're actually forcing ourselves to make a choice between listening to a presenter or listening to ourselves read that content. So this idea of simultaneous reading and listening, that kind of area, that Venn diagram where these two sets overlap, that just doesn't exist in our world according to neuroscience. So really, we need to think about ways to reduce the amount of reading that our participants have to do. And the best way to do that is less copy for them to read. And finally, another big rule I'm a fan of, comes from the literary world, is the rule of three. And if you've taken, for example, applied risk communication, which I hope all of you have, one of the big concepts in that course is the message mapping. And when you message map, you build your message in three parts, and each of those three parts has three supporting parts. That is a great structure for us because humans really love things in threes. We love things with a beginning, middle, and end. We love things with three modules, three pieces, three supporting pieces of evidence. If you remember grade 9 English, they talked about, you have 3 body paragraphs. Every body paragraph has 3 quotes in it, right? So if we can keep your training to that kind of rule of 3, I think we'll be in a much better place in terms of not overloading our participants with our training or our message or our overall message of what we're trying to deliver. In terms of data, here is kind of just a general data point that might be in any presentation anybody gives. So WSIB in Ontario, Workplace Safety and Insurance Board, that's our compensation board here for those of you in other provinces. This is kind of a standard thing I might say to our senior management, right? But I think there's better ways to express this data than in this kind of standard bullet point. So 3 different ways I'm going to discuss, just showing the numbers, showing a graph, and showing it visually. Now, all have their pros and cons depending on the style or the presentation you're going for. So I'm going to elaborate on each. So just showing the numbers is probably makes the most sense if you have people that are really focused on numbers, right? So we don't need to put all the rest of that copy on our slide. We are going to say that. We, as the presenter, are delivering that message by just reading this in the way that sounds like us reading that sentence, right? So we're still going to say that whole sentence. We don't need to put it up on our slide. In fact, putting a whole sentence on our slide puts us in danger of actually reading our slides, and nobody wants to hear a presenter do that, right? Another great way is to show it graphically, but you need to be wary about graphs, because with graphs, I would recommend you only go with a standard simple line or bar graph, and I would also recommend you only stick to 2 different variables, one for each the X and Y axis. When you start getting into more complicated than this, start adding extra things onto this. Oh, let's compare instance statistics and claims costs with our rebates all on the same graph. It starts getting way too complicated, way too difficult for your audience to understand. My personal favorite of the 3 is to show your data visually. And by that, I mean you take an icon that kind of represents your data. So for example, a bag of money in terms of our rebates. Now, of course, this is all changing next year, but right now, this is the way it is. So in 2017, maybe this is how much money we received back from the board. And in 2018, you can see we received about 4 times as much money back from the board. You can still say those numbers, 25 grand and 100 grand, but just showing that visually, I think will resonate better with your audience than either of the other 2 items, although each has their pros and cons, as I said before. And finally, in order to make your presentations easier to understand, we really need to talk about bullet points versus icons. So I just want to talk a little bit further about that. One of the concepts I also have learned doing a lot of research in presentation design is that marketers, content creators, they know the way people read, especially in North America or anywhere where we read left to right, top to bottom. What happens is when we're looking at content, we create these F-shaped patterns with our eyes. So they've actually put participants in a room, they've measured where they've looked on an internet screen, and content creators use this to figure out where the best places to put content is on their web pages. And because we read top to bottom, left to right, we make these F-shaped patterns. So in other words, we might read the whole top line, most of the second line, but as you can see, as we go further and further down the page, we're reading less and less of those lines. And when you look at kind of the bottom part of that page on the right-hand side, we don't even really look there at all. And we haven't read, the bottom half of those lines. So if you think about that in terms of designing a kind of a standard 6x6, let's say, bullet pointed list, nobody's reading the bottom 3 bullets, number 1. The third bullet, people are only reading the first half of it. The second bullet, people are only reading the first 3/4 of it. So what does this mean? They're reading the title and kind of skimming the rest of it without really processing it and then tuning back to you. So why are we spending all this time carefully creating these bullet points if people aren't even reading them, right? So another thing with regard to reading and listening, and we talked about the multitasking idea, but research also suggests that the average adult can read about 250 to 300 words a minute. And the average adult can only listen and understand about 150 to 160 words a minute. So I'm a big fan of hip hop. If you've ever listened to a very fast rap song, it's very difficult to understand what the MC is saying. And I think that's perfect proof to this whole concept right here. So what does that mean for us as presenters and trainers? It means that people are always going to take the path of less resistance, right? So when you put content up on a slide, people are going to read it first because their brain tells them, hey, you're faster at reading, so tune out the presenter, read the content, and then tune back into the presenter. So every new slide we switch to, what's happening is we're losing our audience for 30 seconds, a minute, or however long it takes them to read and process the content you put on that slide, right? So we lost our audience, and it might be the first minute that we have that slide up, that might be our most important message we're delivering verbally. And nobody's even listening to us because they're spending the time reading the content on our slide. And then you've all heard this adage, right? A picture is worth 1,000 words. Very familiar saying. I'm here to tell you now that that is actually false. That's completely untrue. Neuroscience has proven that a picture is not worth 1,000 words. In fact, a picture is worth 60,000 words. So what I mean by that is we actually are able to process images 60,000 times faster and better than just straight textual content. So I think those are kind of 3 compelling reasons to use less and less bullet points and instead put more and more icons onto our supporting AV, whether we're delivering a presentation or a slide deck. So let's apply that now to our kind of our first slide deck we talked about. So here it is, the internal responsibility system. Here's our opening title slide. And as you can see, we've got way too much copy on this slide. So the first thing I would do is I would slash this whole sentence. I'm going to say that. There's no reason for that to be on my opening slide, right? And then we jump into our first of the three parties, the duties of the employer. And I'm going to scrap that first sentence again, because that is something I'm going to say. And in fact, it's really implied by the title of the slide as well, right? So there's no reason to have the title, then have a sentence that kind of elaborates on the title before getting into my actual content, all of these bullet points. Now, what are we going to do about all of these bullet points? That's way too much copy, as I've already said. So this is kind of one of the big takeaways I hope you get from today's webinar. What you need to do with your bullet points, and sometimes I'll start a training or a presentation by creating a slide that looks like this. I'll get all my content on there, I'll put it in full sentence form, I'll put it in bullet point form, whatever way I'm comfortable with. But then what you need to do is go through those bullet points, kind of figure out, well, what are the key words? What are the 2 key words, 3 max within this bullet point that I'm trying to say? Pull those keywords out, and then I strongly suggest you go to an icon searching site. My favorite is thenounproject.com, and that is on the handout for you to check into later. But thenounproject.com has millions and millions of icons. So you search any of these keywords, and you will find an icon that exactly fits with that keyword or loosely fits with that concept or idea. It doesn't really matter how exact it is. Just having that icon, having that visual to support that keyword is going to be huge and making your information easier to understand by your participants, by your audience members. So then we're going to do the same with the duties of the supervisor. Pull out that first sentence, find the keywords in our content, search up icons to match each of those keywords. And you might notice, hey, he actually didn't just pull out the keywords from the due diligence definition. And maybe there is some things in your content where you do want a complete whole sentence. And due diligence is so important, we all know as safety professionals, that maybe I do want to have that entire sentence on the slide just for that one piece of content. And that's okay. I'm not saying that you have to always do this. I'm just saying that you really need to keep those kind of sentences few and far between on your slide deck. And finally, duties of the worker, pull out the keywords, look for icons, etc. So let's clean this up. Now we've got our initial title slide. Doesn't have, hey, you need to understand all the different roles and responsibilities in the IRS, because you're going to talk about that. It just has kind of the 3 key points that we're going to be covering. We had this good quote unquote stock photo here. So let's blow that up and make that a little more engaging for our audience. I'm not going to get into a big thing about stock photos, love them or hate them. A lot of people use them in their slide decks, right? And now here is our recreated duties of the employer slide. Actually, wait a minute, we're doing the internal responsibility system. So why are we flipping between duties and responsibilities? Let's call this the employer responsibility slide. Again, how can we make this as easy as possible for our participants to understand and digest? That's really what we're going for here. So here is our recreated content on this same slide. So as you can see, I've got icons, I've got the keywords. Now, when I talk about each of these, I'm still going to probably say that full sentence, right? So for example, the first piece of content there, your employer is there to ensure that all workers understand the hazards related to their work. And in addition to knowing the hazards, they know how to work safely among those potential causes of harm, right? And if I was actually delivering this as real training, I would probably animate each of these bits of content in one at a time and talk about each of them as I animated them in. Now, for time's sake, I'm just kind of showing you them all at once. What's really, really cool about the tool, my favorite tool, the tool we're using right now, Prezi, is that you can actually dive into your content. So if you want to elaborate on, for example, the definition of competent, you can do that very easily with Prezi without kind of jumping back and forth in different slides. And then remember, due diligence, we decided to keep the entire sentence. And I think, how do you know if you have too much copy or not? It's really governed by punctuation. So in other words, if you need punctuation on a slide, too much copy. If you have one sentence, you don't need a period for that sentence, right? One sentence is fine. Two sentences in a row, that's not cool in my books. That's too much copy. So again, similarly with our supervisor responsibilities, you can see I kind of have that kind of bracket encompassing all of the responsibilities. And I like to talk about how due diligence is kind of a basket clause, how it takes into account all three of these things. So I kind of show that visually with that bracket pointing down at due diligence. And then finally with the worker responsibilities. So I think now we've made our slide deck much easier to understand, and I hope you would agree with that. So before we jump into our next module, the fun module, I think Aaron is gonna bless us with the first of our polls.
Sure. So
Aaron?
I'm going to launch that now so you can see that on your screen, everybody. The question is, the technique that I will use to make my presentations easier to understand is. So I want to get a sense of the ones that Drew presented, which ones appeal to you. So you can make your selection on your screen there, and I'm going to give you a little bit of time to vote on that. I've got a couple of votes in here. I want to get everybody to click on the one that they think that they would use in their own presentations. So we're about 2/3 voting. Anybody else want to vote? 3/4 there. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and close that out now and share the results with you. So 50% said KISS, use less text, 17% said data, and 33% said bullet points, shifting to icons.
Okay, so that's great that all of them have representation. I do think they are all important. And the using less text one, I think, is probably, this is the one I kept going back to. So that is, it is interesting that half of you selected that one.
Great, so that poll is down now and it's back over to you, Drew.
Okay, so back talking about fun. Before I jump into that too far though, I want to show another quick video just to do with fun in safety.
All of you, and myself included, we all have to live under the weird and oppressive regime of health and safety regulations. Which is very strange, isn't it? Because, you know, remember in the old days before health and safety? Remember when it was called common sense? Remember those days? Remember many years ago when you used to go, look, there's a great big deep hole. Will I step in it? No, I'll just walk around it like that. Well, how'd you manage to learn to do that? Well, my parents taught me not to be a moron. And I just kind of carried it on from there.
So that's British comedian Steve Hughes, and I love that whole idea of, you know, common sense. And I think a lot of us can really relate to that whole routine that he talks about, right? And I think injecting fun into your training and into your presentations is really important, because if people are having fun, especially while they're doing something like safety training, then of course they're going to be engaging with the material. Of course, they're going to better understand it and have a better handle on it. So actually, before we get too far into this fun module, let's do another quick poll.
All right, that's up there. So this is a chance for you to do a little bit of self-assessment. Currently, my training presentations are fun. And you can select strongly agree, agree, disagree, or strongly disagree. Go ahead and make those selections. And of course, we don't see who's answering what, so it's okay to be honest on this one. We got about 2/3 of you voting. Give you a couple seconds more to get those votes in. Anyone else? All right, I'm going to close that out and share the results there. So right down the middle, half agree, half disagree, and nobody on either ends there, Drew.
Okay, very interesting. So hopefully we'll be able to pull some of you up from the disagree onto the agree side. And further, let's hopefully pull you all up to the strongly agree side after you learn some of the tools and some of the things that I like to apply when I'm creating training and presentations. So I'm going to talk about evoking competition. I'm going to talk about video, the use of video in training. And I'm just going to talk about, in general, how can we subvert the expectations of our participants that, remember, are coming to attend very what people generally think as dry material when it comes to occupational health and safety. And then we'll apply some of those techniques to that slide deck that we've already done some work on with regard to making it easy to understand. So competition is huge. That's one of the big buzzwords right now in any training environment is gamification. People talk about how can we gamify our training? How can we make it more like playing a game for our participants? There, especially if you have alpha, senior managers in the audience, they are people that are very strongly interested in winning, right? And when you're interested in winning, you engage with your material, right? So if you're gonna have a competition, you have to have cool team names. Don't just call them Team A, Team B, Team from Ontario, Team from the Maritimes. Come up with something, totally off the wall, something totally original. If you have time, let your teams pick their own names. Give a prize for the best team name before you even get started. A couple that my sons helped me come up with, maybe have the Funky Town Monkeys versus the huge Ackmans, right? So just making it fun, making it different, not making it Team 1, Team Red, Team Blue, etc. It really helps. The other thing, when you have competition, you have to have prizes. Prizes and competition go hand in hand. A lot of times we say, you get prestige and respect for winning. It's not enough, right? And I'm not saying you got to break the bank for prizes. I'll show you some of the prizes I've given out in the past. So I've given out, this is one of my favorite prizes I've ever given out. So these little plastic party favors, I guess they are, that I got from the dollar store, a package of 4 for $1. I gave those out one year to winning teams, and actually I lost them all. And where I actually found this one was on the CFO at my organization's hutch. So he has it proudly displayed on his desk, on his hutch from the year, whenever it was 4 or 5 years ago, when his team actually must have won that competition, which all of my learning assessments I try to turn into competitions. And that is an example of a very, very cheap prize you can give out. Some other ones, if you're talking about individual prizes, I stole this one from Yvonne O'Reilly, actually, so I should shout out her. If you say, this next question is for all the marbles, and then the first person to answer it correctly, you simply give them a small little bag of marbles. That is, of course, all the marbles. I've also seen a new car, and then you just give a little toy car. One of the ones that they're still talking about at my organization from training I delivered 8 years ago. 8 years ago, people still talk about this. I talked about, I'm going to give out dinner for 4. And everybody was like, whoa, dinner for 4. People got right into the training. It was the first time we gamified the learning assessment as well. We did a kind of a Jeopardy game. And I'd never seen hooting and hollering in a safety training before. People were razzing other teams. People were shouting out wrong answers to try and confuse other teams and participants. And they were really into winning this dinner for 4. And then, and I forgot to bring one in, but all I handed out was a box of Kraft dinner. And it says 4 servings on the box. And everybody was like, oh my gosh, Kraft dinner. So if you're looking for how can I create competition in terms of my learning assessments, I think game show templates are probably the easiest way to do it. And what's really cool about game show templates is you could Google any of these game shows right now. You could Google Jeopardy PowerPoint template, and you could download for free a whole Jeopardy template in PowerPoint that you would just have to build your own questions, build your own content into. I've done games with all 3 of these, Jeopardy, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, and Family Feud, and all of them have had amazing resonance with the participants in my training sessions. Video, I think, is another element of training that is not used as it should be, One of the things I've learned, when we bought into Turning Technologies here, Turning Technologies is an audience polling system that we use. They say that, you really need to give your audience, your participant members, a soft break about every 7 to 10 minutes. So in other words, you need to stop just lecturing every 7 to 10 minutes and do something different. Now that might be some Socratic questioning, asking your audience to get involved. That might be, you know, other workshop type activities you might have already built into your training. But another easy way to do that is to show a quick video. It gives them a chance to, you know, stop listening to you as the talking head and listen to this element of video that, you know, applies in some way to your training. And some of the places I go to mine videos, I just want to tell you, stand-up comedy. There is tons and tons of great bits in stand-up comedy that you could apply to some kind of safety training. One of the ones that I heard several years ago and actually used in a training on PPE, I heard Jerry Seinfeld talking about, he was on Letterman actually, and he was talking about skydiving. I guess he had just gone skydiving. And one of the things he said to Letterman was, and you could YouTube this and find it, he said, what I don't get about skydiving is these little helmets they make us put on. Do they actually think these helmets are going to do anything in the event that the chute doesn't open? Hilarious bit, especially if you don't understand anything about skydiving, which we professional skydivers, and if there's any of you on the call, I don't know, or if anybody has gone skydiving, understand how important that helmet is. But to hear it from that perspective, from Jerry Seinfeld's perspective, really was hilarious. And it's a great way to start a discussion on what is appropriate PPE, what is reasonable, what is the right type of PPE we need to be using for whatever task we're doing this training on. Sketch comedy shows also have tons and tons of great ideas. Amy Schumer, Key and Peele, Saturday Night Live, Mad TV. If you've ever seen Mad TV Safety Pizza Party, which is the picture I'm referring to here, that is an amazing sketch, particularly if you have an employer that's interested in celebrating lagging indicators. And if you do that, or have an employer that's pushing you to do that, I encourage you to go and YouTube Mad TV Safety Pizza Party. And then sitcoms as well. There is tons and tons of really cool things in sitcoms. I got to go to Seinfeld again. I don't know if you remember the episode where George is at some kid's birthday party and there's smoke coming from the kitchen and he pushes the old lady out of the way and the kids out of the way to kind of evacuate from the fire first. What a great 1-minute video to show to open up your fire safety training that you're going to begin to discuss. And finally, another gem that I think is very underutilized is commercials. There are tons and tons of really, really cool commercials that may in some way apply to whatever modules or whatever the content is that you're delivering. Now, the picture I have here, this is actually it's a Starburst commercial. It's called Starburst Factory. YouTube it. I wish I could just sit here and show you a ton of videos, but for time's sake, I can't. Basically, a great commercial to start a WHMIS conversation. These guys are standing over this vat of horrific acid. They drop the Starburst in it. They reach in to grab the Starburst, and their arms are gone. And they keep trying to get the Starburst, keep losing their arms. Hilarious 30-second spot to start your WHMIS training for your audience, for your participants. And very satirical look on WHMIS, but then again, it's not that far from what was actually happening pre-1988, pre the introduction of WHMIS in Canada, right? People are exposing themselves to hazardous materials, not even knowing the potential health effects before they said, hey, we need to start creating this information system, and et cetera. I'm not going to get into WHMIS. I know you all know that as well. So one of the other things I want to say about video, in this YouTube world that we're living in right now, and in this, Instagram, and we watch videos on our tiny little devices, we don't need 4K videos. We don't need, super high definition, high quality videos. You could, and I'm not going to tell you how to do it on this webinar, but Google it. There is a way to save videos from YouTube. Doesn't really matter what the quality is, as long as it's understandable and it ties to your content, then that's going to be a great feature in your next training presentation. And lastly, in terms of making it fun, just want to talk about subverting expectations. And what I mean by that is just doing something unexpected, right? So one of the things that I love about Steve Jobs, if you've ever watched him give a product launch, he makes very bold statements in that product launch. And I remember, and if you've ever watched the iPod launch, he holds up this little tiny device, which of course, wasn't very commonplace back when he did this launch. And he said, you know what, this is 1,000 songs in your pocket. Now, that is just the norm now. Everybody says, everybody has 5,000 songs on their phone. But before that iPod, that was unheard of. Nobody could picture having more than, 15 or 20 songs on a burned CD, for example. So having 1,000 songs in your pocket, that was a supremely bold statement for him to make. Another great thing to do is give demonstrations. And I got to go to Steve Jobs again with the iPad launch. He didn't talk about the actual dimensions of it. He didn't put up a bullet point list of, how wide is it? How thick is it? How heavy is it? All he did is he said, you know what, these things are so portable, you can actually stick them in one of these envelopes we have floating around the office. And he stuck the iPad in an inner office envelope. And that little demonstration did way more than putting any numbers on a screen or showing a measuring tape or anything like that. That quick demonstration got the point across about how portable an iPad was, right? And then this is one probably most of you do, or I hope you do already. And in fact, the courses I have taken, the CHSE courses I've taken, I know that all of you instructors are heavily experienced with your subject matter, and telling a story, sharing an experience, something related to the content you're discussing, that is a really, really great tool for a trainer to use as well. Everybody in presentations and training now is talking about storytelling and how can we tell more stories? What is your story? So there's really two levels to storytelling with training. You can tell a story on one piece of content, one bullet point, for example, but you also want to have a kind of an arc of a story for your entire training, right? So think about both those concepts in terms of storytelling for your next training presentation. And finally, just with design, you can really subvert expectations. And here's a perfect example of that. I don't care what PowerPoint template you use, if you downloaded it off online and it's, super rare PowerPoint template. If it's a template, it's expected. People expect this type of an opening slide deck, right? This, on the other hand, a little bit unexpected, I would hope. A little bit different from the norm. So that's really what you need to think about with your design is, how can I be outside the norm? How can I be outside the box? So I just wanted to ask each of you, and you can type into the chat right now, which of these do you already do? And which of these would you like to start doing? Or which of these do you think you could start doing in some of your training? Whether that be the CHSE course that you deliver, or maybe training or presentations you deliver to your employer and or clients. So go ahead and type those into the chat box now, and I'll get Erin to read them out as they are typed in.
All right, so we've got one from Erica. She says, awesome job, Drew. Love the tips and enthusiasm. Looking forward to adding some icons and some fun. So other things from folks in response to Drew's question. Storytelling.
So how can you subvert?
Ryan says storytelling and working on design is what he's taking away.
Great.
So specifically, how can you subvert expectations? Now using story, Michelle says he's already using storytelling. Any ideas for going beyond that, Michelle? How else can you subvert expectations? Anyone else? Michelle plans to increase demonstration, so adding more of that into his.
Great, yes. One of the demonstrations I have done in an infectious disease course I've done, and I don't know if any of you have ever used GlowGerm. GlowGerm is an amazing tool. It's basically a cream that's invisible to the eye, but under black light you can see it. And you can do that to do, hand washing exercises and see how well people, what kind of hand hygiene people have. That is an amazing, effectively demonstration to talk about infectious disease or talk about hand hygiene. It's just one idea for you.
And one last comment here, Drew, before you go on. Afraid to use videos, have had problems with getting them to run. That's from Heather. So yeah, they can be technical issues sometimes with some of these.
Yeah, and that's fair. And I think it's getting better and better. If you use a tool like PowerPoint or Keynote or whatever your kind of supporting presentation tool of choice is, Prezi is super easy to embed videos into as well. So I encourage you all to have a look at that tool. But yeah, great responses. Thank you, everybody. So let's apply some of that to our initial slide deck now, that IRS slide deck. So we had this initial opening slide with the title. We talked about the 3 parties, and we were going to kind of discuss what the IRS means here. And we have this kind of boring stock photo here to start our conversation off. Maybe instead of all this, maybe we start with a video. And if you know the WSIB Prevent It commercials, if you don't know them, first of all, and you're a safety person, you need to see these. They are amazing. There are 5 of them. They're all on YouTube. My favorite of them is Shop Girl. That's the picture here. And basically, there's this horrific, quote unquote, accident. And when they talk about the accident, they say this wasn't an accident. And then they start calling out different responsibilities that have failed in the IRS. So the employer should have done this, I should have done that, where was my boss, etc. And that 30-second commercial is a great way to start the conversation off with IRS. It really kind of sets the tone and lets everybody understand that the internal responsibility system is not fault finding, it's a shared legislated teamwork type system. And here's a perfect example of how it can go wrong, right? So then we come to our employer responsibilities, and maybe before, as part of your IRS training, you don't go right into the responsibilities or the duties right away. Maybe you talk about what is the definition of an employer, you know, and you explain what that means, and you talk about, you know, contract of service versus contract for service, and maybe you talk about WISN and you talk about contracting services as part of it, I don't know. But anyways, to make it more fun, what I do in my IRS slide deck is I actually liken my organization to the Galactic Empire, and I say the employer is really like Darth Vader. And I talk about how Darth Vader's at the top of the kind of Galactic Empire, just like my employer is. And then I'll still go through all that same information we talked about, all those different responsibilities. And when we get to supervisor, I'll liken him to the Grand Moff, the general that's in charge of the Death Star, which of course everyone knows is General Tarquin. Thank you, Star Wars fans out there. And I couldn't find a Tarquin icon on Noun Project, but I could find a Death Star icon. Anyways, and then we go into all the responsibilities as well, and then get to finally our worker responsibilities. And I'm sure all of you know this one, likening your organization to the Imperial Starfleet. The workers are, of course, the stormtroopers, the boots on the ground, doing the work, supplying the services, and then we can go through each of their responsibilities. So now we've made our slide deck a little bit more fun, as well as easy to understand. So finally, we're going to talk about how could we make it memorable. And I'm just going to show one final video about memorableness. This is probably the most memorable moment I've ever had watching a movie since I've been a safety professional.
Train's leaving. Do I get on the train?
Don't get on the train, I'm not sure he's on it. Give us a minute.
Do I get on the train?
Bond,
What?
get on the train.
He's keen to get home.
Open the door, please. Open the door.
Health and safety. Carry on.
Oh yeah, Bond makes health and safety cool, doesn't he? When I saw that, I almost died. I was like, this is the best thing ever that cinema has ever offered the health and safety profession. I'll never forget that scene from Skyfall, James Bond. Anyways, let's talk about how we can make our presentations a little more memorable. So three things we're going to discuss. We'll talk about spatial memory. We're going to talk about metaphors, and then just some other stuff because I couldn't think of a good title to kind of encompass a bunch of other gems I wanted to drop on you. So spatial memory, I want to start with that. Spatial memory is our ability to remember locations and places. Spatial memory is the reason why you can leave your work and drive home without, map questing it every single time, without using your GPS. Spatial memory is one of our oldest memories. We've had it since basically prehistoric times because we needed to know, where do the woolly mammoths breed? Where are the berries ripe for picking? All of that type of stuff, right? With our hunting and gatherer aspects of our life. If we compare spatial memory, this very, very old memory in terms of human existence, with semantic memory, which is our ability to remember words and or text, spatial memory is going to win out every single time. We've only had the ability to remember words in our text. Well, we've only been literate as a human race for the past, 200, maybe 300 years. And that might be even exaggerating a little. So we've only had that as part of our memory or of our ability to remember and our brain processing information for the last few hundred years, versus spatial memory we've had right back to the very beginning of Homo sapiens, right? So because it's so much older, our brains are much better at doing it. And I'll give you a perfect example. If I ask any of you to describe the appliances in your kitchen right now to me, guaranteed what you're all doing as you say them aloud, sitting in your office or wherever you're watching this webinar, guaranteed you're all visualizing your kitchen, right? You're visualizing, where's my stove, where's my fridge, where's my Keurig coffee maker, my toaster, etc. You're visualizing where it is, and as you visualize it, you're able to describe, what are the appliances in my kitchen? What do they look like? None of you at all, I'm sure, generated a bullet point list of the appliances in your kitchen, right? So there's perfect proof that spatial memory is very, very powerful. So how can we apply this in training and or presentations? Well, with Prezi, it's very easy, because Prezi takes you on a virtual tour of your training presentation, right? But if you use a different supporting AV tool like Keynote or PowerPoint or whatever, I want you to think about, where do you put content on your slide? Because that can be very important. People will remember not only the bits of content, but whether you put them on the bottom left, the top left, in the center, top right, etc. So think about the design of your slides in terms of where you're going to put each of your bits of content, because especially if there's some kind of relationship, maybe a hierarchical relationship. For example, if you're talking about the hierarchy of controls, if you kind of list them from top to bottom or from left to right, that kind of really can help in terms of understanding why being closer to the source is much better than being closer to the worker. And people will have that kind of spatial memory of not only memorizing those 6 levels, but remembering where they were placed on the slide, particularly if you have an icon to match each of those keywords, right? So metaphors are also hugely, hugely important. And I think if you're not using metaphors already, you really need to think about how you can use them more and add them more into your training and or presentations, because metaphors are a key to success, right? Metaphors take something that is very novel or something that is foreign, and they make it understandable. They make it tangible. They make it memorable, right? And let's face it, for most participants that aren't safety geeks like us on this call, safety is not something that they're going to remember tomorrow. So the more you can make it tangible, the more you can give them something to kind of remind them of the concept you're talking about, the better chance you have of sinking that material into their brain, making it sticky so that they'll remember it when they need to call on it. And I'm sure all of you do this already. If you've read any Weber, talk about the evolutionary model of safety culture, we can liken it to kind of climbing that mountain as we go through each of those levels of safety culture. Or I know you all use this one, the cost of accidents, the iceberg metaphor of $1 in direct costs related to $6 in indirect costs when we're talking about, what an accident can actually cost a company, right? So you could talk about, giving them Disney World is my metaphor for today. I've tried to use all kinds of metaphors inadvertently and hidden throughout my supporting AV. You might notice the raining cats and dogs picture right up here by the metaphor. So let me ask each of you, is there any metaphors you currently use in your CHSC courses? Let's just narrow it to that field for right now. Go ahead and type that into the chat and I'll get Aaron to read them out.
Oh, I'm here and I'm watching. So any metaphors you use already in your CHSC courses or CSSE courses? Nothing yet here.
Oh no, maybe nobody uses any.
We can expand on it to say, is there anything you will think you could use?
That's a great idea. Or maybe expand it to other training and/or presentations you also give for your client and/or employer.
Any thoughts,
And
folks?
if you don't, sorry, Aaron?
Oh, just asking if they have any thoughts.
Maybe nobody does, or nobody has any ideas. And if that is the case, I strongly encourage you to, next time you're creating training, spend some time thinking about what is the overall goal of this training. Now, if I were to sum up this training in one sentence, what is that one sentence? And is there a metaphor, is there a visual picture that can kind of summarize that entire sentence? Because if you can kind of show that picture as much as possible during the training, it will really drive that core message through that the whole reason for delivering that training is. Right? Okay, let's move on. Some other techniques with regard to making your training and/or presentations memorable. Audience participation, which is something I know all of you already do. People remember what they share in a training session, right? So the more you can have them share, the better they're gonna remember what they shared, the context it was shared in, and hopefully the whole bit of content you were talking about when you asked people to share their experience or share whatever it is that the bit of content that you're training or giving a presentation on. Learning assessments are a great way to make things more memorable. And the thing about learning assessments, I think in the safety world, we've kind of drilled ourselves into thinking a learning assessment has to be, you know, a quiz, a multiple choice quiz, or a full applied knowledge type essay quiz, the way it is in the CSSE courses, right? But there are lots of other ways to assess learning. Right? Having a discussion about the content or the concept you've just delivered is another great way to kind of engage and understand if people have kind of have a learning, assess the learning of your participants, right? So one of the tools I'll do is I'll go on things like failblog.org or There I Fixed It and find a safety fail photo, and I will ask, use this exact photo in a hazard recognition course that I deliver. And then I'll pull this up and I'll say, well, what hazards do you see? We've just gone through a whole bunch of understanding of hazards and understanding how to recognize hazards. What do you see here in this photo? And we'll have just a discussion amongst us. And the more people bring up hazards, the more they really are, you know what, hey, I'm gonna remember this. This material is familiar to me. I'm applying my knowledge now to this picture. And as a presenter, as a trainer, you're assessing their learning. What is the level of engagement in this discussion? How many people are sharing pieces of information, right? Evoking a strong emotion is also a great tool for making something memorable. And I'm sure most of you have seen a Threads for Life speaker. They evoke a very strong emotion in us. So if you can do that in some way, shape, or form in your training, either end of the spectrum, happy or sad, it can really help make things stick, make things more memorable. And finally, this one from the marketing world. The marketing world knows that we need to show our content in a minimum of 7 different ways. So the more ways we can show content, the more ways that people will engage with and remember that content. Marketers know you don't go out and buy, you know, a Ford Taurus without seeing a commercial a couple of times, without test driving it, without talking to the dealership, without getting the print material on the Taurus. You know, you go through all those different pieces of content, and it's not until you've done it about 7 times that you decide, you know what, I'm gonna buy a Ford Taurus, right? Or whatever you decide to purchase or consume in this world. You've probably seen it about 7 different ways before you've decided to actually try that material out. We should be trying to think about that as safety professionals as well, especially with regards to training. How much can I give this training legs? What can I do during the training? So, you know, can I evoke audience participation? Can I do a learning assessment? Do I have a video? Do I have a great metaphor? Do I have lots of great icons in use? All those things are different ways to deliver our content, but then further than just our training, do we have a poster campaign afterwards? Do we have an all-staff email that kind of refreshes on that training? The more ways we can get it into their brain, the more stickier it'll be, the more memorable it'll be. So let's apply those now to our slide deck, that IRS slide deck that we started off with, the memorable techniques, I mean. So I've got my 3 slides, my employer, supervisor, and worker. And you can see just the fact that I'm moving up and down on the slide is going to help that spatial memory, right? And I might jump into each of them. And again, I would talk about who the employer is. I would go through each of these bullet points of content and animate them in one at a time as I'm describing, you know, the employer's role in the IRS. Moving up in that direction, which is why Prezi is such a great tool for spatial memory, can really help people go, hey, employer's down here, supervisor's up here, and it really sinks into their brain in that same way. And then we go through the supervisor's responsibilities. I've already showed you the rest of this slide deck, right? And the worker's responsibilities. But what can really help now is, let's talk about the big picture of the IRS. And my favorite metaphor to describe the IRS is that it's like a 3-legged stool. So in order to have a 3-legged stool, you need each of the legs in place. So everybody needs to be fulfilling their role and responsibility in the first place. But second of all, if any of those legs happen to crack or break, well, then the whole stool falls over, right? And it's really not a question of blaming one particular leg and saying, oh, it's all your fault, leg A or leg 2. It's, oh, shoot, the stool's broken. We need to fix the stool so we can sit on it again. And the IRS is much the same in the safety world, right? So now we've got a great metaphor to really help people sink that IRS into their brain. Now maybe we do a quick learning assessment where we throw up a safety fail and we talk about it through the lens of the IRS. So here we have a worker working unsafely. As you can see, they've got, 6 skids piled on 2 sawhorses to get up to do their task at height. We can investigate this through the lens of the IRS. So how did the employer fail in this photo? How did the supervisor fail? How did the employee fail? Having that discussion, having people share their own perspective on each of those 3 things, I guarantee you they will highlight all of the relevant duties of each of those parties in the IRS, and it'll be way more effective than any all of the above multiple choice question you could ever deliver to assess their learning. So I think we've now taken that initial slide deck that was just riddled with text, and we've made it a lot more easy to understand. We've made it more fun by using some Star Wars references, and we've made it much more memorable with a metaphor, with learning assessment, by evoking spatial memory. And I hope that each of you take something away from this webinar, and we'll now, when next time you're creating training into our presentation, we'll think about how can I make this easy to understand, how can I make it fun for my participants, and what can I do to make it memorable for them? In other words, how can I give them Disney World to make their training experience much better and make safety and training, a much more positive thing than it has been, I think, in the past. So I'll turn it back over to you, Erin.
Great.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Thank you. And we had a couple of metaphors come in and one question. So metaphors first. Heather said, how about traveling or trip planning as a possible metaphor? And Ryan says he often uses doing taxes as similar to the risks associated with complex and infrequent tasks. So 2 metaphor suggestions there.
Great. Thank you, guys. I did that really selfishly because I wanted some more for my own content.
And the one question I have, and there's still time if you want to ask a question. The one question is, Paul was asking, he likes the use of Prezi, and he's wondering what version you use. If you could talk a little bit about what you're using in Prezi and what's available to them.
Okay, so yeah, I should have mentioned that off the hop. This is an unreleased alpha version of Prezi that I'm using. I'm not even supposed to discuss what it's called. But when you're actually standing up in front of an audience and delivering, your Prezi would look more like this, right? And you'd be standing in front of the slide and you'd be able to talk through each of your examples. This Prezi that I'm using is not released yet, and strictly for webinars and for keynote style presentations. And I'm very blessed and humbled to have been asked as a Prezi user since the beginning to trial and be one of the beta testers on this tool. But yeah, that is what I'm using right now. But there are, in terms of Prezi itself, I am a huge believer in it. I've been using it since 2011. And as soon as I started using it, I immediately stopped using PowerPoint. I just think it's gotten better and better and better over the years. If you haven't been on Prezi in the last couple of years, you should definitely have another look at it because they've made it much more user intuitive in the last couple of years. And one of the other very cool features now is they actually have 5 million pictures and icons built right into the platform itself. So you don't even have to go outside to something like the Noun Project or KISS PNG to find your icons anymore. Good question, thank you.
Thanks, Drew. Just one comment from Erica. Great presentation, loved it, and look forward to applying the suggestions. So we will wrap with that comment. I'm just going to remind folks that there's going to be, when you exit from the presentation, there's going to be a survey that will pop up on your screen. I invite you to participate in that. Give us some feedback on the presentation for Drew and for us as with this new Instructor PD initiative we're running. And now I'm going to just hand things over to Stuart again.
Thank you very much, Aaron. Drew Douglas, that was amazing. Thank you so much. My training world will be a whole lot different going forward. And I'm sure others have picked up a lot of tips that they'll be able to use as well. Thanks to all the participants for joining in. And I hope you found it rewarding and enjoyable. And we can go back and look at our recording from time to time to pick up some of those tips that we may have missed or have forgotten. But I don't think we're going to forget about this a lot, Drew. Thank you so much again.
Thanks everybody for being here. Thanks, Drew. Thanks, Stuart, and have a safe day, everyone.
Okay, I'm out.